Settlers mocked the widow for drying weeds all summer. Thomas Hennessy, who had survived 15 San Juan winters, told her flatly, "A woman alone can't cut enough timber. You'd best find a husband or head back to wherever you came from before you get those kids killed." She had $11, 2 children, and needed 8 cords of firewood she could not cut. On December 8th, 1883, 3 avalanches buried the only railroad out in a single night. But 5 months earlier, Kirsty Mekela had never foraged a single meal from American soil in her life. She arrived in Red Mountain Town in May of 1883 with $7, 2 children, and a husband's death certificate folded in her coat pocket. The certificate said mine collapse. It did not say that Arvo Mekela had been dead for 3 days before anyone bothered to dig him out. It did not say that the mining company offered his widow $60 and passage back to Duluth if she would sign a paper saying she held no grievance. Kirsty did not sign. She took the $60 in a freight wagon south instead, following rumors of a boarding house for sale in a place called Red Mountain. The San Juan Mountains rose around her like prison walls made of stone and snow. The wagon climbed for 2 days through passes that narrowed until the sky became a blue ribbon overhead. At 11,000 feet, the air thinned, and her daughter Aino, 8 years old, developed a nosebleed that lasted 6 hours. Her son Aino, 5, stopped talking entirely and simply stared at the peaks with the hollow expression of a child who has learned that the world contains things too large to comprehend. Red Mountain Town sat in a valley between 3 peaks streaked with rust-colored ore. The rust gave the mountains their name. It also poisoned the streams and turned the willows brown. 200 souls lived there in summer, working the Yankee Girl and Gustin mines. In winter, that number dropped to perhaps 60, those too stubborn or too poor to leave. The boarding house cost $52. Kirsty counted out the bills twice before handing them over to the departing widow who had run it previously. The woman accepted the money, looked at Kirsty's children, and said nothing encouraging. She was on the next freight wagon north before sunset. The building measured 16 by 24 feet. It contained 6 cots for boarders, a cook stove with a cracked firebox, and a lean-to kitchen where Kirsty and the children would sleep on straw ticks. The roof leaked in 2 places. The door hung crooked in its frame, leaving a gap at the bottom where wind whistled through, carrying flakes of snow even in May. There was no root cellar, no woodshed, no privy, just a 3-sided shelter over a hole that the previous owner said would need to be moved in September. Kirsty had $15 remaining. Flour cost $4 per 100 pounds in Red Mountain. Bacon was 60 cents a pound. Coffee, when it could be had at all, was $1.25. She calculated what $15 would buy and understood immediately that it would not be enough. She calculated what 6 boarders at $3 per week would earn and understood that she needed boarders to survive but could not feed boarders without money and could not earn money without boarders. The mathematics of her situation formed a closed loop with no exit. Thomas Hennessy ran the general store. He had operated it for 15 years, surviving winters that killed less prepared men, building a fortune modest by Denver standards, but immense by the measure of Red Mountain. He knew every resident by name, knew their debts, knew their prospects, knew which ones would still be alive come spring. When Kirsty entered his store and asked about credit, he studied her the way a man might study a horse he suspected was lame. "Finish," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." "Your husband worked copper in Michigan before coming to Colorado." "Yes." "Copper men think they understand cold." Hennessy arranged cans on his shelf without looking at her. "They don't. Michigan cold is a child's tantrum. This cold," he gestured toward the peaks visible through his window. "This cold is patient. It waits until January, when you think you've won, when you've made it halfway through. Then it comes for you, 40 below. 50. Wind that freezes spit before it hits the ground. I need flour and lard, Kirsty said. I can pay half now, the rest when my boarders arrive. Boarders? Hennessy smiled without warmth. Mrs. Mekala, I've watched 11 families arrive in Red Mountain in the years I've been here. Families with children. 8 of those families are now in the cemetery on the ridge. The other 3 left before their first winter ended. He set down the can he was holding. The men who survive here are men, single, strong. They work 16-hour shifts and sleep in company bunkhouses heated by company coal. They do not have children who need milk. They do not have wives who need doctors when the passes close. They do not run boarding houses. Then who ran the boarding house I purchased? Ingrid Solberg ran it for 2 years. She buried her husband in year 1 and her son in year 2, diphtheria. The doctor was in Silverton. The pass was closed for 9 weeks. Hennessy's voice carried no cruelty, only fact. She sold to you because she couldn't bear another winter in the building where her boy died. I would not have sold to you, but I didn't own it. Kirsty felt her children pressed against her skirt, Ino's fingers digging into the fabric. I need the flour and lard, she repeated. Hennessy sighed. He measured out the flour himself, weighing it precisely, extending no generosity in the scale. You'll need 8 cords of firewood to survive the winter, he said as he worked. At minimum, 10 would be safer. A strong man with a good axe can cut a cord in 2 days. You are not a strong man. You have no axe, and you have 2 children who cannot cut wood, cannot haul water, cannot do anything except consume resources and die if you fail to provide for them. He pushed the flour across the counter. That's not cruelty, Mrs. Mekala. That's arithmetic. Come spring, when the pass is open, I'll buy this building from whoever holds your note. I'll give fair price, but I won't extend credit to a woman who'll be dead by February. It's not personal, it's just poor business. Kirsty paid for the flour. She carried it back to the boarding house in silence, Ino and Ano trailing behind her, their footsteps crunching on patches of snow that still lingered in shadowed places, despite the calendar claiming May. That night, after the children slept, she sat at the crooked table and counted her remaining money, $11. She needed a cook stove repair, a door that sealed, a woodshed, an axe, and food enough to feed boarders she did not yet have until they paid her money she could not yet spend. The mathematics remained impossible. But Kirsty had grown up in Ostrobothnia, in the flat western marshes of Finland, where her grandmother taught her things the shopkeeper in Red Mountain had never learned. She'd grown up in a place where winter lasted 7 months, and the poor survived not by buying their way through, but by knowing what the land offered for free. She looked out the window at the rust-colored mountains, at the willows along the poisoned stream, at the marshy flat where snow melt pooled in a small pond. And she saw something Thomas Hennessy, for all his 15 years in the San Juans, had never learned to see. She saw food. The cattails grew thick at the pond's edge, their brown seed heads standing like sentries above the spring melt. In Finland, Kirsty's grandmother had called them Osman Kami, the plant that could be eaten root to tip, season after season, without ever planting a seed. The roots could be dried and ground into flour. The young shoots could be eaten like asparagus. The pollen collected in summer stretched wheat flour further. And unlike wheat, cattails asked for nothing, no plowing, no seed, no purchase from Thomas Hennessy. Kirsty waded into the cold water on the first morning of June. The muck sucked at her boots. Her skirts grew heavy and dragged, but when she pulled the first root from the mud, thick as her wrist, dense with stored starch, she felt something she had not felt since the telegram arrived telling her Arvo was dead. She felt possibility. The nettles grew along the stream bank where the mine tailings hadn't poisoned the soil. In Finland, nettle soup had been a spring staple, the first green food after months of preserved provisions. Her grandmother had dried nettles in bundles, hanging them from the rafters of their farmhouse, crumbling them into jars that lasted through the darkest months. 100 grams of dried nettle contained more iron than spinach, more protein than most beans, enough vitamins to keep teeth and gums and bones from softening. The settlers in Red Mountain walked past the nettles every day. They saw weeds. Kirsty saw survival. And on the slopes above town, where the lodgepole pines grew dense and straight, Kirsty saw the food that had kept Finns alive through famines that killed a quarter of the nation. Pine bark, the inner layer, the cambium, could be stripped, dried, and ground into flour. It tasted of resin and desperation. It sat heavy in the stomach, but it contained something that prevented the disease sailors called scurvy, the disease that made gums bleed and teeth loosen and old wounds reopen as if they had never healed. Kirsty knew this because her grandmother had known this, and her grandmother's grandmother before that. The knowledge was 3,000 years old. It had survived because the people who held it survived. She began explaining her plan to Martha Dawson on a morning in late June. Martha ran the other boarding house in Red Mountain, a larger building, better maintained, consistently full of miners who could pay. Martha was American-born, practical, and not unkind. She had helped Kirsty repair the cook stove in exchange for 2 days of laundry work. Now she stood at the edge of the cattail pond, watching Kirsty haul roots from the muck, her expression caught between pity and bewilderment. "You're pulling swamp grass," Martha said. "Cattails. The roots are food." Kirsty held up a thick rhizome, muddy and dripping. "My grandmother made flour from these." "Flour? You dry them, then pound them, then sift." Kirsty dropped the root into her basket, already half full. 1 acre of cattails produces more flour than 10 acres of wheat. This pond alone. Kirsty. Martha's voice carried the careful patience of someone addressing a person they suspected had lost their mind. "You can buy flour at the store with money. I have $11. Then you need boarders." "Not," Martha gestured at the pond, the basket, the mud climbing up Kirsty's skirts. "Not whatever this is. I need to survive until boarders come, and I need food for when they arrive. Food I cannot afford." Kirsty waded deeper, reaching for another root. "So I will make food that costs nothing." "It costs your dignity." Martha lowered her voice, glancing back toward town. "People are talking. They're calling it squaw work. Hennessy told the men at the Yankee Girl that you've been grubbing in the mud like a—" She stopped herself. "Like a digger," Kirsty finished. "I know the word. It's not just talk. Cornelius Vance has been asking questions about your deed, about whether you have proper title, about whether a foreign woman without a husband can legally hold property in Colorado territory." Kirsty's hand stilled in the water. Cornelius Vance ran the Guston mine. He owned 3 buildings in Red Mountain, including the saloon, and he had made no secret of wanting to own more. The boarding house lot sat on the main road, convenient to both mines. If Kirsty failed or if she could be removed, the property would be available. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggest he'd prefer you weren't here." Martha folded her arms against the mountain chill. "Kirsty, I'm trying to help. Forget the swamp roots. Come work for me. I'll pay $1 a day for kitchen help. You can save through summer, and in fall, I'll have enough dried food to feed my family through winter, without buying from Hennessy, without credit, without debt." Kirsty climbed out of the pond, her basket heavy, her boots squelching. "My grandmother survived winters that killed thousands. She survived because she knew what the land gave freely when everyone else only knew what they could buy. I will do the same. Martha shook her head slowly. Your grandmother lived in Finland. This isn't Finland. The cattails don't know that. Neither do the nettles. Neither does the pine bark. Pine bark? Martha's expression shifted from concern to alarm. You're eating tree bark? Not yet. I'm drying it for winter. Kirsty, people will think you've gone mad. People can think what they like. Kirsty hoisted her basket onto her hip. Come February, when the passes are closed and the flour runs low, they can explain to their empty stomachs how sane they were. She walked back toward town without looking back. The basket weighed 30 pounds. Her arms ached, her dress was ruined, and somewhere behind her, she knew, Martha Dawson was already composing the story she would tell at dinner about the crazy Finnish widow who thought she could survive the San Juans on swamp grass and tree bark. The summer passed in mud and nettles, and the steady accumulation of what everyone in Red Mountain agreed was garbage. Kirsty rose before dawn each day. She worked the cattail pond until her back screamed and her hands bled from the rough leaves. She carried baskets of roots to the flat rocks behind the boarding house, where she spread them to dry in the thin mountain sun. She peeled the roots, sliced them, dried them again. The drying took days. The pounding took longer. But by July, she had her first jar of cattail flour, 3 pounds of off-white powder that smelled faintly of swamp and tasted, when she made it into flatbread, like something halfway between potato and cardboard. The children learned to help. Aino, quiet and watchful, proved skilled at harvesting nettles. She wrapped her hands in rags and stripped the leaves with careful precision, never complaining about the stings that inevitably penetrated the cloth. Aino, still not talking, collected rose hips from the wild roses that grew along the stream, small red fruits that dried easily and could be steeped into tea or ground into powder. Kirsty did not tell them that rose hips contained 50 times the vitamin that prevented scurvy. She only said that the tea tasted good and kept sickness away. By August, the lean-to kitchen had transformed into something between a pantry and an apothecary. Bundles of dried nettles hung from the rafters, 40 pounds by Kirsty's estimate, enough protein and iron for months. Jars of cattail flour lined the shelves, alongside crocks of dried cattail shoots, and bags of processed root fiber. Birch bark containers held rose hips, dried and ready for steeping. And in the corner, stacked like firewood, lay strips of pine cambium, the inner bark she had spent 3 weeks harvesting from fallen lodgepoles on the slope above town. The bark harvesting had been the hardest work. Each strip required finding a fallen tree, peeling back the outer bark, and scraping the thin layer of cambium beneath. The scraping blistered her hands. The climbing exhausted her legs. But her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. Petulepa kept us alive when the wheat failed. The trees give what the fields cannot. Kirsty had harvested 200 pounds of cambium. Dried and ground, it would yield perhaps 60 pounds of bark flour, enough to stretch her cattail flour through the longest winter. The miners noticed. Of course they noticed. In a town of 60 winter residents, nothing went unobserved. They watched the Finnish widow climb the slopes with her baskets. They watched her wade the pond in all weather. They watched the strange bundles appearing on her drying racks, the jars multiplying on her shelves. And they talked. Cornelius Vance talked loudest. He stood outside the saloon on an evening in late August, voice carrying across the main road to where Kirsty was spreading cattail slices on her rocks, and he made sure she could hear. "I've seen Indians eat better than that woman feeds herself," he said. "Root grubbing and bark scraping. It's not Christian work. It's not even civilized work." The men around him murmured agreement. "And the children," Vance continued. 2 young ones living in that shack, eating swamp weed. If that's not grounds for the territorial authorities to intervene, I don't know what is. Kirsty's hand stilled over the drying rack. Ino beside her had gone rigid. She has no husband, Vance said. No income to speak of. No visible means of support except grubbing in the mud. In any proper town, those children would be placed with a family that can provide for them. The orphanage in Denver, someone offered. The orphanage, yes. Better than starving in a shack while their mother goes mad from the altitude. Kirsty turned. She walked across the road, her boots leaving prints in the dust, her spine straight despite the exhaustion that made her bones feel hollow. The men fell silent as she approached. "Mr. Vance," she said, "you own the Guston mine." Vance smiled. He was a large man, well-fed, wearing a coat that cost more than Kirsty's entire summer earnings. "I do." "How many men have died in the Guston since you took ownership?" The smile flickered. "Mining is dangerous work." "7," Kirsty said. "I asked at the assay office. 7 men dead in 3 years, including 2 Norwegians and a Swede." She kept her voice level, almost pleasant. "Their widows went to Denver, their children went to orphanages, and you expanded the mine onto the claims their husbands had worked. Those claims were legally purchased." "I'm sure they were." Kirsty looked at the men gathered around Vance. Several of them worked his mine. Several had worked alongside the dead. "I'm also sure that when winter comes and the passes close, your miners will eat salt pork and beans and coffee from Hennessy's store. The same food that gave half the men in Leadville the bleeding gums and loose teeth they try not to talk about. The same food that will kill some of them slowly while you profit from their labor. Now see here. My children eat weeds." Kirsty smiled, and the smile was not warm. "Your workers eat scurvy. In spring, we will see whose diet was madness." She turned and walked back to her drying rack. Behind her, the silence stretched. Then Vance laughed, a forced, uncomfortable sound, and said something about crazy foreigners that his companions echoed with less conviction than before. Ino looked at her mother with something like wonder. "Keep spreading the roots," Kirsty said quietly. "We have work to do." September brought the first serious snow and the first serious test of Kirsty's preparations. The storm arrived on the 7th, 3 weeks earlier than usual. It dropped 18 inches in 36 hours and reduced the temperature from 50 degrees to 19 between sundown and midnight. Kirsty had spent the previous week weatherproofing, rags stuffed in gaps around the door, oiled paper over the windows, a barrier of pine boughs around the north wall to break the wind. But the cook stove still drafted poorly, and the wood supply, 4 cords, half what Hennessy said she needed, had cost her last $8 and all of her pride. The wood had come from Eric Lindqvist, a Swedish miner who had taken a room at Martha Dawson's boarding house. He had approached Kirsty on the street, affecting casualness, and offered to sell her his spare cordwood at half the going rate. "I cut too much," he said. "Won't fit in Dawson's shed. You'd be doing me a favor." It was not true, and they both knew it. Lindqvist had cut exactly what he needed. He was giving Kirsty charity and disguising it as commerce to protect her dignity. "Half rate," she said. "I wouldn't take more. The wood's already seasoned, burns clean, 4 cords." "I have $8. Lindqvist calculated visibly, subtracting from the fair price, accounting for the falsehood of his oversupply story. "8 is fair," he said, "for 4 cords of wood that I need to be rid of." Kirsty paid him. The transaction took less than a minute. Neither of them acknowledged what had actually happened. But that night, after Lindqvist's friends had stacked the wood in her new shed, a structure she and Ino had built from scrap lumber over 3 August weeks, Kirsty added his name to a list she kept in her Bible. It was a short list. It contained the names of people who had helped when helping cost them something. She did not know when she might repay the debt, but she knew she would remember. The September storm proved her preparations partially adequate and partially insufficient. The door held. The oiled paper kept the wind out. The cook stove, patched and coaxed, produced enough heat to keep the main room above freezing. But the 4 cords of wood burned faster than she had calculated, and by the storm's second day she understood that 4 cords would not last until Christmas, let alone spring. She also understood something else. The cattail flour worked. On the storm's first morning, with 18 inches of snow blocking the door and the world turned white and howling, Kirsty made flatbread from her summer's harvest. She mixed cattail flour with a small amount of wheat flour, added water, and fried the cakes on the cook stove. They emerged dense and slightly sweet, with a texture like heavy potato bread. Ino ate 2 of them without hesitation, the first real appetite he had shown in months. Ino ate one and asked for another. "It tastes like home," Ino said quietly, "like something Momo would make." Momo. Grandmother. Kirsty felt something catch in her throat. "Your great-grandmother," she said. Momo's mother. She survived the Great Famine with bread like this, when all the wheat died and the people walked to the cities looking for food that wasn't there. She stayed on the farm and ate what the land gave her. Did people laugh at her? Kirsty looked at her daughter, at the serious eyes that had seen too much death for 8 years. "Yes," she said, "until they stopped laughing and started dying. Then they came to her door asking for help." "What did she do?" "She helped them. Because that's what you do when you know something that can keep people alive. You share it, even with people who laughed." Ino considered this. Outside, the wind screamed against the walls, driving snow into drifts that would take days to clear. Inside, the cook stove crackled, and the smell of cattail bread filled the small space. And for a moment, just a moment, the 16 by 24-foot building felt less like a prison and more like a fortress. October brought miners seeking rooms. The summer crews were departing, heading down to Silverton and Durango and warmer altitudes before the passes closed for good. But a core of men stayed through winter, the ones who had claims to protect, debts to work off, or nowhere else to go. Some of these men needed boarding. 3 of them chose Kirsty's establishment, not because she offered anything Thomas Hennessy or Martha Dawson could not match. She couldn't, but because her rates were lowest and her building was closest to the Yankee Girl Hoist house. The miners were named Patterson, Gruber, and Olmsted. Patterson was American, Gruber was German, and Olmsted claimed to be Canadian but had an accent that suggested somewhere much further east. They paid $2.50 per week each, covering their room and 2 meals daily. 2 meals daily for 3 men plus 2 children required more food than Kirsty had anticipated. The cattail flour disappeared faster than she had planned. The dried nettles went into every soup. The wheat flour she had purchased in summer, 60 pounds, meant to last until spring, was half gone by late October. But the men ate without complaint. Gruber, in particular, seemed fascinated by Kirsty's cooking. "This bread," he said one evening, holding up a piece of the cattail flatbread. "What is in it?" "Flour," Kirsty said, "from the marsh." "From the—" Gruber stared at the bread, then at her. "The cattails. You make flour from the cattails. The roots, dried and ground." Gruber took another bite, chewing thoughtfully. "In Bavaria," he said, "my grandmother made bread from acorns when times were hard. Eichelbrot. People said it was big food, but we survived winters that killed others." He finished the bread and reached for another piece. "This is not pig food. This is clever food." Patterson snorted. "Clever food is beef and potatoes. This is what you eat when you can't afford beef and potatoes. Then it is clever, Gruber said, because she cannot afford beef and potatoes, and yet she eats. Patterson had no response to this logic. November brought the cold that Thomas Hennessy had warned about. The temperature dropped to 15 below on the third night, 30 below on the seventh. The water bucket inside the boarding house froze overnight despite the banked fire. Kirsty woke each morning to frost on the interior walls, ice crystals forming on the blankets, her breath visible in the gray pre-dawn light. The wood burned faster than ever. 4 cords became 3, then 2.5. Kirsty calculated and recalculated, rationing each log, letting the fire die lower at night than was comfortable, layering every available blanket on the children's bed. By mid-November, she understood that the wood would not last, that she would need to buy more from Hennessy at whatever price he demanded, and that she did not have enough money. The boarding fees covered food, barely. They did not cover wood. They did not cover the lamp oil running low, or the candles she could not afford to replace, or the hole developing in Eno's left boot that let the snow in when he walked to the privy. And then, on November 23rd, the last supply wagon of the season arrived from Silverton with a cargo manifest that made Kirsty's throat tighten. Flour, $4 per 100 pounds, up from $3.50. Bacon, 90 cents per pound, up from 60. Coffee, $1.75, up from $1.25. Wood, $14 per cord, up from 10. Hennessy stood behind his counter with the expression of a man who knew exactly what these prices meant and felt no particular guilt about them. Supply and demand, Mrs. Mekla. The pass will close any day now. What's in this store is what we have until April, maybe May, depending on the snow. I need 2 cords of wood. That's $28. Kirsty had $11.40. She had earned it cooking, cleaning, laundering, every spare hour not spent on the boarding house given to work that paid cents when she needed dollars. I can pay $14 now, the rest by January. You can pay $28 now, or you can freeze. Hennessy's tone carried no malice. He genuinely did not care if she froze. He merely wanted his money before she did. I've got 8 families asking for wood and 6 cords to sell. I can't hold inventory for promises. $14, half the price. I'll work off the rest. Cooking, cleaning, whatever you need. I have a wife for cooking and cleaning. Then I'll pay in food. The words came out before Kirsty had fully formed the thought. I have dried provisions, flour from cattails, vegetables from nettles, rose hips for tea that prevent scurvy, food you can't buy in any store because no store sells it. Hennessy laughed. Swamp weed and tree bark? Mrs. Mekla, I've eaten well all my life. I don't intend to start eating poverty food now. It's not poverty food, it's survival food. Your wife could. My wife could walk out the door right now and find 10 women eager to do whatever work you're offering in exchange for real money. Money that buys real food. Hennessy turned to arrange stock on his shelves. $28 for 2 cords. When you have it, come back. Kirsty left the store without the wood. She walked back to the boarding house through 6 inches of fresh snow, the wind cutting through her coat, the mathematics of her situation forming the same closed loop it had formed in May. 2 cords short of surviving winter. No money to buy them, no way to earn the money fast enough, and the temperature still dropping. The blizzard arrived on December 7th. It was not the worst storm Kirsty had ever seen. The winds were strong but not exceptional, 50 miles per hour, perhaps 60 in gusts. The snow fell heavily but not catastrophically, 2 feet in the first day, another 18 inches the second. By Red Mountain standards, it was an ordinary early winter storm, the kind that buried buildings to their window sills and kept everyone indoors for 3 or 4 days until the digging out could begin. But this blizzard carried something ordinary storms did not. It blocked the railroad. The Denver and Rio Grande line to Silverton crossed several avalanche chutes on its approach to the San Juan Basin. The combination of heavy snow and high wind created slabs on the slopes above the tracks. Sometime in the night of December 8th, 3 of these slabs released within hours of each other, burying the rails under 20 feet of debris in 3 separate locations. Kirsty did not learn this until December 11th, when Patterson returned from the Yankee Girl with news that spread through Red Mountain like fire. "The railroad's gone," he said. "Completely blocked. They're saying it could be weeks before they dig through, maybe longer." "How long is longer?" Gruber asked. "Depends on the weather. If it keeps snowing." Patterson shook his head. "Could be spring before anything gets through." Kirsty stood at the cook stove, stirring a pot of nettle soup. Her hands did not shake. Her voice did not waver. She had been waiting for this, not this specific disaster, but something like it, something that would test whether she had prepared well enough, stored enough, calculated correctly. "How much food is in town?" she asked. "Hennessy says he's got supplies for 60 days, maybe 90 if people ration." "And wood?" Patterson exchanged a look with Gruber. "Wood's going to be a problem. Half the buildings in town don't have enough to last till February." "Including this one," Kirsty said quietly. The room fell silent. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind was rising again. "Including this one," she repeated. "I have 1.5 cords left. At current burn rate, that lasts 3 weeks. Maybe 4 if we freeze during the day and only heat at night." "You could burn furniture," Olmsted offered. "I could burn furniture. I could also burn the building itself, plank by plank, starting with the lean-to. That would add perhaps another 2 weeks." Kirsty set down her spoon. "Or I could do what my grandmother did when the fuel ran low and the winter ran long." "What's that?" "Burn less. Eat more. The body makes its own heat when you feed it enough. The cattails I dried have more calories per pound than coal has per ton. The nettles have iron that keeps the blood strong. The rose hips—" "The weeds," Patterson interrupted. "You're talking about surviving on weeds." "I'm talking about surviving." Kirsty met his eyes. "The railroad is blocked. The store has 90 days of food for a town that needs 150. The wood is short. The temperature is dropping. In 6 weeks, people in Red Mountain will be dying. Not from avalanches, not from mine accidents, from hunger and cold and the scurvy that comes from eating nothing but salt pork and flour. Scurvy's a sailor disease. Scurvy is a diet disease. It killed 10,000 miners in California. It killed men at every army fort on the frontier until they started growing vegetables. It will kill people in Red Mountain if the blockade lasts long enough." Kirsty turned back to her soup. "I have 300 pounds of dried food that no one in this town would eat if you paid them. Food that prevents scurvy. Food that provides heat. Food that I spent every day of summer preparing while people called me mad." She ladled soup into bowls. The steam rose fragrant with nettle and wild onion, and something indefinable, the smell of a preparation made with desperate hope for a moment exactly like this one. "We're going to survive this winter," she said. "All of us in this building. And when the pass opens in spring, we're going to walk out healthy while others are carried out dead. I need you to trust me. I need you to eat what I cook. And I need you to not complain when the fire dies down and the blankets get thin." She set the bowls on the table. "Can you do that?" The 3 miners looked at the soup. They looked at each other. They looked at the windows, where snow was already drifting past the glass, piling higher with each passing hour. Patterson picked up his spoon. "I've eaten worse in worse places," he said. "And I've trusted people I liked less." He took a bite of the soup. then another. His expression shifted from skepticism to something more difficult to read. It's good, he admitted. It shouldn't be good, but it's good. Gruber was already eating. Olmsted followed. And outside, the storm continued to build. By Christmas, half of Red Mountain was hungry. By New Year's, some were starving. The railroad remained blocked. Every attempt to dig through the avalanche debris was met by fresh slides, as if the mountain itself had decided that no one would leave or enter until spring. Hennessy's predictions proved optimistic. His supplies lasted not 90 days, but 58 before rationing became mandatory. Men who had mocked Kirsty's preparations in October were now paying $1 for a cup of her nettle tea, $2 for a handful of dried rose hips. And Kirsty, whose stores had seemed absurdly excessive in the warmth of summer, found herself calculating how far her 300 pounds of dried food could stretch when she was feeding not 5 people, but a line that formed at her door each morning. She had not planned for this. She had planned for her family, for her boarders, for herself. She had not planned to become the only source of food that prevented the bleeding gums and loosening teeth that were beginning to appear in faces throughout town. But she remembered her grandmother's words. She remembered what you did when you knew something that could keep people alive. You shared it, even with people who laughed. The line began forming before dawn. Kirsty had not announced she was selling food. She had not posted prices or spread word through the saloon, but in a town of 60 people trapped together by walls of snow, news traveled without effort. Someone had told someone who told someone else that the Finnish widow had a cellar full of strange provisions, and that the men who boarded with her looked healthier than anyone had a right to look after 3 weeks of rationing. On the morning of January 4th, 1884, Kirsty opened her door to find 11 people standing in the cold. Their faces were gaunt. Their lips were cracked. Several had wrapped scarves around their mouths to hide the bleeding gums that had become impossible to ignore. Thomas Hennessy stood at the back of the line. Kirsty said nothing. She simply began measuring out portions, a cup of dried nettles here, a handful of rose hips there, a small bag of cattail flour for those who could pay, and a smaller bag for those who could not. She did not set prices. She asked what people could afford and accepted whatever they offered. $3 for a pound of mixed provisions from those who had money, a pair of wool socks from a miner who had nothing else, a promise of labor from a man too weak to work but determined to repay. When Hennessy reached the front of the line, he did not meet her eyes. "I need rose hips," he said, "for my wife, her gums." He stopped. The words seemed to cost him something. "I know about the gums," Kirsty said. "I've seen it before." "In Finland?" "In every place where people eat only what they can buy and forget what the land gives freely." She measured out a generous portion of dried rose hips, far more than she had given others. "Steep these in hot water. Make her drink the tea 3 times daily. The bleeding will stop within a week. The teeth will tighten in 2. Hennessy looked at the rose hips in his hand. They were small and wrinkled, not much to look at, dried fruit from a wild plant that grew on every stream bank in the San Juans, ignored by everyone who passed. "How much?" he asked. "What can you afford?" Something shifted in his expression. For a moment, Kirsty thought he might actually answer honestly, might admit that his store was nearly empty, that his profits were meaningless when there was nothing left to sell, that he was as trapped and frightened as everyone else in this frozen valley. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a $5 coin. It was more than anyone else had paid. It was also, Kirsty suspected, less than the rose hips were worth now, that they were the only thing standing between Margaret Hennessy and the disease that was eating Red Mountain from the inside. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Tell your wife to eat the hips after she drinks the tea. Don't waste any part of them." Hennessy nodded. He turned and walked back toward his store, shoulders hunched against the cold, moving like a man who had just learned something he would rather not have known. The scurvy spread faster than Kirsty had expected. By mid-January, a third of Red Mountain showed symptoms. The bleeding gums came first, then the fatigue that made simple tasks exhausting. Old wounds reopened, cuts that had healed months ago began seeping again, as if the body had forgotten how to hold itself together. Men who had worked 12-hour shifts in the mines now struggled to walk from their bunks to the privy. Women who had managed households with brisk efficiency found themselves needing to rest after climbing a single flight of stairs. And then the deaths began. William Cotter was the first. He was 63 years old, a veteran miner who had survived cave-ins and explosions and a bullet wound from a claim dispute in '68. He had spent the winter eating salt pork and beans from Hennessy's store, supplemented by coffee and occasional hardtack. He had refused Kirsty's provisions when offered, calling them immigrant garbage loud enough for half the town to hear. On January 19th, his bunkmates found him dead in his bed. His body was curled into a ball, limbs contracted, face frozen in an expression that suggested the end had not been peaceful. The doctor, a young man named Carver who had been trapped in Red Mountain while passing through on his way to Durango, examined the body and pronounced the cause as scurvy, complicated by heart failure. His connective tissue was dissolving, Carver told the small group gathered outside the bunkhouse. The collagen that holds the body together. Without vitamin C, it simply stops being made. The body falls apart from the inside. Vitamin C, someone repeated. What's that? Something in fresh fruits and vegetables. Something in. Carver paused. He looked at Kirsty, who had come with the others when news of the death spread. Something in rose hips and nettles, and probably half the things Mrs. Makela has been drying all summer. The crowd turned to look at her. The expressions varied: curiosity, skepticism, and in a few faces, the dawning horror of people who had refused her food and were now watching their own gums bleed. Cotter wouldn't eat her weeds, someone said. Said he'd rather die than eat like a squaw. He got his wish, another voice replied. The words hung in the frozen air. No one laughed. The second death came 4 days later. The third and fourth came within a week of each other. By February 1st, Red Mountain had buried 6 people, all of them men who had refused or been unable to obtain Kirsty's provisions. The cemetery on the ridge, the one Hennessy had mentioned in May, the one that held 8 families who had tried and failed to survive, added 6 new mounds of frozen earth, and still the railroad remained blocked. The Denver and Rio Grande had sent crews to dig through the avalanche debris. 3 times they had cleared significant progress. 3 times fresh slides had buried their work. The mountains were not finished with Red Mountain. The snow kept falling, the wind kept blowing, and the passes remained sealed as effectively as if God himself had decided that no one would leave until he was ready. Kirsty's stores dwindled. 300 pounds of dried food had seemed like an enormous surplus in August. Now, feeding not 5 people, but 30, the number who came to her door each day had grown as word spread and desperation deepened. The provisions vanished faster than she could measure. By early February, she had perhaps 80 pounds remaining. At current consumption, that was 3 weeks of survival for the people depending on her. 4 if she cut the portions, 5 if she cut them again and watched the children grow thin. She had not planned for this. She had planned to save her family. She had not planned to save a town. But what choice did she have? What choice did anyone have when they possessed knowledge that kept people alive and others were dying for lack of it? Ano fell ill on February 9th. It began with a cough, dry and persistent, The kind that could mean nothing or could mean everything in a place where doctors were scarce and medicine was scarcer. By evening, the cough had deepened. By midnight, the boy was burning with fever, his small body radiating heat that seemed impossible given how cold the building had become. Kirsty had been rationing wood for weeks. The fire burned low during the day, lower at night, barely enough to keep the water bucket from freezing solid. She had accepted the cold as necessary, warmth cost fuel, and fuel was running out faster than food. But now, with Eno shivering despite his fever, his breath coming in shallow gasps that fogged the air above his bed, Kirsty understood that her careful calculations had failed to account for one critical variable. A sick child needed warmth. A sick child needed constant warmth, sustained warmth, the kind of warmth that burned through cordwood like fire through paper. She had half a cord remaining. Doctor. Carver came when Kirsty sent Ino running through the snow. He examined Ino with hands that shook from the cold, listening to the boy's chest with a stethoscope that had to be warmed against his skin before it would function. Pneumonia, Carver said. Or heading that way. His lungs are congested. The fever's trying to fight it, but... He looked around the room, at the thin fire, at the frost creeping up the interior walls. He needs heat, sustained heat, for days, possibly a week. I have half a cord of wood. That's not enough. I know. Carver stood. He was young, perhaps 25, and Kirsty could see in his face the particular anguish of a man who had been trained to heal and found himself in a place where healing was often impossible. There might be wood available. Hennessy had some in reserve. Vance's people have been burning furniture from the empty buildings, but there might be. Hennessy's reserve is for his family. Vance won't sell to me at any price. Kirsty's voice was flat. She had stopped expecting help from either man weeks ago. What else can I do? Keep him warm, keep him fed, keep fluids in him. Carver paused at the door. And pray that his body is stronger than the disease. Sometimes that's all we have. He left. The door closed behind him, and a gust of cold air swept through the room, setting the thin fire guttering. Ino looked at her mother. She was 8 years old, and she had already learned that the world contained things too large for adults to fix. "Mama," she said, "what do we do?" Kirsty looked at her son, at his flushed face and shallow breathing, at the fever that was trying to save him and might kill him instead. She looked at the half-cord of wood that would not last the week Carver said he needed. She looked at the provisions on her shelves, the cattail flour and dried nettles and rose hips that had kept a town alive but could not keep a fire burning. And then she looked at the building itself. 16 by 24 feet, pine boards and rough-hewn beams, a lean-to kitchen, a roof that had once leaked and no longer did because she had patched it with tar and prayer. "We do what we have to do," Kirsty said. "We burn what we must to keep your brother alive." She picked up the axe. The lean-to kitchen came down on February 10th. Kirsty worked through the day, pulling boards from walls she had reinforced just months before, prying nails from beams she had straightened herself. The destruction was precise and deliberate. She took only what she needed, only what would burn clean, only what could be spared without collapsing the structure entirely. The kitchen had been a luxury anyway. They could cook in the main room, they could sleep in the main room, they could survive in 16 by 20 feet if they had to survive in nothing else. The boards burned hot. Pine was good that way. It caught quickly, flared brightly, turned the small cook stove into a furnace that pushed the temperature in the main room above 50 degrees for the first time in weeks. Eno's fever broke on the morning of February 11th, then returned that evening, then broke again. His breathing eased, then tightened, then eased. The pneumonia was fighting, and his body was fighting back, and the outcome remained uncertain. Gruber helped with the dismantling. So did Patterson and Olmsted. The three boarders had paid for room and meals, not for nursing duty, but they had watched Kirsty care for her son through 2 sleepless nights, and something in that watching had changed the nature of their arrangement. They were not tenants anymore. They were something closer to family, the kind of family that forms when strangers face death together and discover they would rather not face it alone. The north wall, Gruber said on the evening of the 11th. The wind comes from the north. If we insulate it with snow... Snow melts, Patterson said. Not if you pack it tight and keep the inside temperature low. The Eskimos build houses from snow. Whole houses. The snow insulates better than wood. We're not Eskimos. We're also not dead. I'd like to keep it that way. They spent the night packing snow against the north wall, creating a barrier 3 feet thick that blocked the wind more effectively than the pine boards ever had. The temperature inside rose another 5 degrees. Ano's fever stayed broken through the night. By February 13th, the boy was sitting up. By the 15th, he was asking for food. By the 17th, he was talking again, words emerging hesitantly at first, then in a flood, as if the months of silence had been storing up language that now demanded release. "Mama," he said on the morning of the 18th, "I dreamed about the cattails." Kirsty was stirring a pot of nettles soup, thick with the last of the dried greens, fortified with cattail flour to give it substance. "What kind of dream?" "I was in the pond. The water was warm. The cattails were talking to me." "What did they say?" Ino considered the question with the gravity of a 5-year-old who has been very sick and knows it. "They said thank you for eating them. They said that's what they're for." Kirsty felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them back. She ladled soup into a bowl and carried it to her son. "Eat," she said. "The cattails want you to get strong." The railroad reopened on February 23rd. The news arrived by way of a man on snowshoes who had made the journey from Silverton in 3 days, a feat of endurance that would have seemed impossible in December, but seemed merely remarkable now after 9 weeks of learning what impossible actually meant. The avalanche debris had finally been cleared. The first supply train would arrive within the week. Red Mountain had survived. Barely. Of the 63 people who had begun the winter in the valley, 57 remained. 6 were buried on the ridge. All 6 had died from scurvy or its complications. All 6 had refused Kirsty's provisions, either from pride or poverty or the particular stubbornness that afflicts certain men when salvation comes from a source they consider beneath them. The numbers would matter later, when the territorial newspapers wrote their accounts and the Denver health authorities began asking questions about why a mining camp had suffered such mortality when the disease had been preventable. But on the morning of February 23rd, the numbers mattered less than the simple fact of survival. They had made it. The passes were open. Help was coming. Kirsty stood in her doorway, the doorway of a building that now lacked a kitchen, lacked half its north wall, lacked most of the features that had made it a boarding house rather than a fortified shelter, and watched the townspeople emerge from their various hibernations. They moved slowly, these survivors. They moved like people who had forgotten what it felt like to not be cold, not be hungry, not be afraid. Thomas Hennessy emerged from his store. He looked a decade older than he had in September, and his wife Margaret walked beside him with the careful gait of someone whose body was still learning how to hold itself together. But she was walking. She was alive. Her gums had stopped bleeding 3 weeks ago, and her teeth had stayed in her head, and she would live to see another summer because a Finnish widow had given her dried rose hips when nothing else in Red Mountain could help. Hennessy crossed the muddy street to Kirsty's door. He stood there for a moment, looking at the dismantled building, at the snow packed against the north wall, at the thin smoke rising from the chimney. You burned your own kitchen to keep your boy alive, he said. I burned what I had to burn. Your own kitchen? Hennessy shook his head slowly. I told you in May that you'd be dead by February. I told you those children would freeze. You did? I was wrong. The words came out rough, reluctant, but they came out. I was wrong about the food, wrong about the wood, wrong about whether a Finnish widow could survive a San Juan winter. He paused. My wife would be dead without your rose hips. Half this town would be dead without your weeds. And I stood in my store and laughed at you. Yes, I'm not laughing now. Kirsty looked at the man who had refused her credit, who had called her food poverty food, who had told her that her children would die and offered no help to prevent it. She could have been angry. She could have demanded apology, acknowledgement, payment for all the provisions she had given at cost or for free. She could have reminded him of every dismissal, every smirk, every time he had turned away while she struggled. Instead, she thought of her grandmother. She thought of what you did when you knew something that could keep people alive. Next summer, she said, I'll show you where the cattails grow, and the nettles, and the roses. I'll show anyone who wants to learn. Why would you do that? Because next winter might be worse, and the winter after that. And the railroad will always be vulnerable to avalanches, and the store will always run low, and the mountains don't care how much money anyone has when the passes close. Kirsty turned back toward her ruined building. The land gives food for free. It gives medicine for free. It gives survival to anyone willing to learn how to take it. That knowledge shouldn't belong to one person. It should belong to everyone. Hennessy was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter than Kirsty had ever heard it. I have lumber in the back of the store, enough to rebuild your kitchen, enough to repair the north wall. He held up a hand before she could speak. It's not charity. It's payment. For Margaret. For the tea. For... He gestured vaguely at the town, at the survivors, at the morning light spilling over mountains that had tried to kill them and failed. For everything you did when I wouldn't help. I'll accept the lumber, Kirsty said, but I'll also teach you about the cattails. I don't need... Everyone needs to know. That's the point. She met his eyes. Your children might survive you. Their children might come here looking for silver. The mountains will still be here. The snow will still come. And someday, someone will be trapped the way we were trapped, and they'll need to know what the land gives freely. That's more valuable than lumber, Mr. Hennessy. That's knowledge that saves lives. Hennessy looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once and turned back toward his store to arrange for the lumber delivery. Martha Dawson came next. She arrived at midday, carrying a pot of soup she had made from provisions Kirsty had sold her weeks earlier. The soup was thin, nettles and cattail flour stretched with melted snow, but it was warm, and Martha had seasoned it with something that made the smell almost pleasant. I thought you might be hungry, Martha said. You've been feeding everyone else. Someone should feed you. Kirsty accepted the pot. She invited Martha inside, and they sat at the crooked table that had survived the winter intact, and they ate soup together in a building that no longer had a kitchen. I called your food squaw work, Martha said quietly. In June, I told you it wasn't dignified. I remember. I was wrong. You were afraid, for me, for what people would say. Kirsty set down her spoon. Fear makes people say things they don't mean. I meant it when I said it. That's what shames me. I meant it because I believed that some knowledge was beneath people, that some survival was undignified. Martha's voice caught. And then I watched Cornelius Vance refuse your rose hips out of pride, and I watched him bury 2 of his miners, and I thought, dignity didn't save them. Pride didn't save them. Your weeds saved everyone who swallowed their pride long enough to eat them. Not everyone, No, not everyone. 6 people died because they wouldn't listen to a Finnish widow. Martha looked at the walls, the packed snow visible through the gaps, the morning light filtering through oiled paper. How many would have died if you hadn't been here? Kirsty had done the calculation. She had done it multiple times during the long nights when Aino burned with fever and the wood ran low, and she wondered if her preparations had been enough. Without the rose hips, the scurvy would have spread faster. Without the nettles, the protein shortage would have weakened everyone. Without the cattail flour, the calories would have run out weeks earlier. She paused. 20, perhaps. Maybe more. It's hard to know. 20 people alive because of swamp grass and tree bark. Because of knowledge, Kirsty corrected. The plants are everywhere. The knowledge is what's rare. Martha finished her soup in silence. When she rose to leave, she paused at the door. I want to learn, she said. In summer, when the cattails come back, I want you to teach me. I will. And I'll pay you. Real money, not charity. You'll pay me by teaching someone else when I'm gone, when you're old, when the next generation needs to know. Kirsty smiled. That's how knowledge survives, not by hoarding it, by spreading it until it can't be lost. Even Cornelius Vance came eventually. He did not apologize. Men like Vance rarely apologized. Their self-image depended on never having been wrong. But he came to Kirsty's door on the morning the first supply train arrived, and he stood there with his hat in his hands, and he asked a question that cost him more than any apology ever could. The bark flower, he said. The pine bark. How does it work? Kirsty could have made him beg. She could have reminded him of every insult, every threat, every time he had suggested her children should be taken away. She could have refused him entirely, let him figure out for himself how to strip cambium, how to dry it, how to grind it into something edible. But that was not how her grandmother had taught her. That was not how you kept knowledge alive. The inner bark only, she said. The layer between the wood and the outer bark. You strip it in spring when the sap is running, or in fall after the first frost. You dry it flat, then grind it. Mix it 1/4 with wheat flour for bread, 1/3 for flat cakes. And it prevents the bleeding disease? It prevents scurvy. Yes, the Sami have known this for 3,000 years. Vance absorbed this information with the expression of a man writing figures in a mental ledger. The mines will need to know this. If we get cut off again, teach them. Teach everyone. I don't. Vance stopped. His jaw worked. I'm not a teacher, Mrs. Mekala. I'm a mine operator. Then find someone who can teach and pay them to do it. Build a drying shed. Hire women to harvest nettles and cattails through summer. Create a reserve that doesn't depend on railroads or supply wagons or anything that an avalanche can block. Kirsty stepped closer to him. You wanted me gone, Mr. Vance. You wanted my land and my children, and my failure to prove that your way was the only way. But your way killed 6 people. My way kept 57 alive. If you're smart, if you're as smart about survival as you are about silver, you'll learn from that. Vance's face reddened. For a moment, Kirsty thought he might turn and leave, might retreat into the comfortable armor of his pride. Instead, he put his hat back on his head. I'll build the drying shed, he said, and I'll hire whoever you recommend, but you'll teach them. You'll teach them exactly what to gather and how to preserve it. At fair wages. At fair wages, Vance paused. And I'll replace your kitchen, the lumber and the labor, before summer. Hennessy already offered lumber. Then I'll provide the labor, skilled carpenters, a proper kitchen, not the lean-to you had before. He met her eyes, and something in his expression suggested that this offer cost him more than the money ever could. You saved my workers' lives, Mrs. Mekala. The ones who would listen anyway. That has value. I'm not good at saying thank you, but I'm good at paying debts. Kirsty nodded. Then we have an agreement. Vance left without another word, but he kept his promise. The carpenters arrived in March before the last snow melted, and they built Kirsty a kitchen twice the size of the one she had burned. By summer's end, 14 people in Red Mountain knew how to harvest cattails. 11 knew the nettles. 7 had learned the pine bark. Word spread beyond the valley, to Silverton, to Ouray, to the scattered camps along the Red Mountain Pass, that a Finnish widow had kept a town alive through the worst winter in a decade, and that she would teach anyone who wanted to learn. Kirsty charged nothing for the lessons. She accepted whatever people offered, food, labor, sometimes money, sometimes nothing at all, and she taught without discrimination to the wives of mine operators and the widows of dead miners, to the shopkeepers and the saloon girls and the Chinese laundrymen who lived at the edge of town and had their own knowledge to trade. The drying shed Vance built filled with provisions before the first snow of 1884 fell. Red Mountain entered its next winter with 600 pounds of dried plant food in reserve, not enough to survive a full season without the railroad, but enough to supplement whatever supplies made it through, enough to prevent the scurvy that had killed 6 people the year before. No one laughed at the Finnish widow anymore. Kirsty Makela lived in Red Mountain for 11 more years. She operated her boarding house through winters that ranged from mild to brutal, through boom times when silver prices soared and bust times when the mines closed and the population dwindled. She taught her children the old ways, the cattails and nettles and bark flower, and she taught anyone else who asked. When she died in 1895, at the age of 53, she was buried on the ridge above town, in the cemetery that Thomas Hennessy had once warned her about. Her gravestone read simply, Kirsty Makela, 1842 to 1895. She fed the hungry. Aino Makela grew up to teach school in Durango. Aino Makela became a mining engineer and spent his career improving safety conditions in the tunnels where his father had died. Neither of them ever forgot the winter of 1883, the winter when their mother burned her own kitchen to keep them alive, and fed a town on food the town had called garbage. On the morning of February the 23rd, 1884, the temperature in Red Mountain rose to 14 degrees above zero, the warmest it had been since December. The passes were opening, the trains were coming, the 9 weeks of isolation that had begun with an avalanche were finally ending. 57 people had survived, 6 had not. Thomas Hennessy had stood in his store 9 months earlier, watching a Finnish widow count out $11 for flour and lard, and he had told her the truth as he understood it. You'll need 8 cords of firewood to survive the winter. A woman alone can't cut that much timber. You'd best find a husband or head back to wherever you came from before you get those kids killed. He had been right about the firewood. Kirsty had never cut 8 cords. She had never cut a single cord. She had bought 4 from a Swedish miner and burned her own kitchen when those ran out. But she had not found a husband. She had not gone back. And her children had not died. They had lived because their mother knew something Thomas Hennessy had not known, something his 15 years in the San Juans had never taught him. She knew that survival did not always come from stores or supply wagons or railroads that could be blocked by snow. Sometimes it came from the land itself, from the plants that grew wild in the marshes and along the streams and on the mountain slopes, from the cattails and the nettles and the pine bark and the rose hips, from the weeds. Kirsty stood in her doorway on that February morning, watching the town come back to life, watching the survivors emerge from their long hibernation. Her building was half ruined. Her stores were exhausted. Her body ached from 9 weeks of labor and fear, and the particular exhaustion that comes from keeping others alive when you are barely alive yourself. But the sun was warm on her face. The sky was blue above the mountains. And somewhere behind her, in the main room of the boarding house that had almost become a coffin and instead became a refuge, her son was laughing. Aino was laughing. It was the first time she had heard him laugh since before Arvo died. Kirsty closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her, the sound of survival, the sound of spring returning, the sound of a boy who had nearly died discovering that the world still contained things worth laughing about. She had done what her grandmother had done. She had kept her family alive when everyone said it was impossible. She had fed the hungry and taught the ignorant, and proven that knowledge passed from mother to daughter across 3,000 years was stronger than any winter the mountains could conjure. And now the passes were open, and her son was laughing, and the weeds would grow again in summer.